Hello, government students. Mr. Rosenleaf coming at you. And as we've started a new unit this week, we are going to talk about kind of the evolution of America's two-party political system, which is unlike many other systems throughout the world. Most countries, especially like Western, quote unquote, Western democracies, function on multiple parties. Great Britain has, they have two major parties, but then they have a slew of more minor parties that actually make a big difference in how government operates. France has multiple parties. The Germans have multiple parties. Etc., etc., etc. That is the norm in what are known as parliamentary systems of government. Well, America is not a parliamentary system. We are what's called a presidential system, where we elect a strong president and then we have a Congress that goes along with that. But for many years, we have not had more than two political parties represented. There have been times in the past where a third party has snuck in, and we have some independents and things like that sitting in Congress. But really, throughout our history, it's been two major parties. And so today we're going to take a look at some examples of how that system evolves and how it changes over the years, some of the changes in sort of balance of the parties and the ideology of the parties and how the parties attract different voters. And then we're also going to talk about sort of why the two-party system dominates in the United States, the advantages and disadvantages of two-party democracy, and then we'll close and I will give you your reflection question for the reflection journal. So let's get underway here. And of course, the true origin of America's two-party systems comes back to these two guys who we talked about previously. On the left, you have Alexander Hamilton, and on the right, you have Thomas Jefferson. So George Washington, as I think we've stated before, was not a part of a political party. He did not really believe that parties were a good thing. In fact, many of the founders of the country, the people that were part of like the Declaration of Independence, and even some of the people that wrote the Constitution, didn't want parties to really dominate American politics. In fact, they were pretty careful not to bring mention of parties into the Constitution for fear that they would become expected. But parties eventually emerge, which is a natural thing. This isn't like it's some sort of unnatural, unholy thing. People who have similar ideologies are going to sort of come together in groups. It's lonely to be all by yourself. And so they're going to come together in groups. And the first ones, of course, are the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, but also with members like John Adams. And even some historians will argue that Washington himself, even though he never declared himself to be a Federalist, certainly functioned as a Federalist president. And so the Federalists were advocating for a strong central government, and I know we've talked about this before. Strong central government wanted a national bank, wanted the national government to take on the debts of the states, so as to unite the country instead of advocating for more power to the states, advocate for more power to the national government as a uniting factor for all Americans. The opposition to this was, of course, led by Thomas Jefferson, and this was, of course, the Democratic-Republican Party, also known as the Jeffersonian Democrats, also known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. So anytime you hear Democratic-Republican, Jeffersonian Democrats, Jeffersonian Republicans, this is the party of Thomas Jefferson, the opposition party to the Federalists that will become really the dominant party in American politics. But again, Washington really felt that parties truly were not great. And so even though Washington largely functioned as a Federalist, he himself didn't see himself that way. Even though Hamilton was really Washington's voice, and at least his background writer, his ghostwriter. And so a lot of what Washington did was, if not dictated by Hamilton, certainly strongly influenced by Hamilton and his words. Now, the Federalist Party will eventually decline by the time we get through the 1800 presidential election, when Jefferson beats Adams, and of course we see everything go down with Aaron Burr and Jefferson and all that jazz, and a few years later Burr kills Hamilton in a duel, and really the Federalists are starting to wane. By the time we get through the War of 1812, the Federalists are really pretty well gone from American politics. So consider how these early divisions emerged, and how they how do this sort of set up future conflicts, future political conflicts. Again, this was a fight between strong central government and strong state governments, and some of that has persisted into the present day. So definitely be thinking about that. The next shift, if you want to call it that, in American democracy happens just a few years down the road from that. And that involves certainly the guy on the left there, Andrew Jackson, who is the country's 7th president. And then the opposition to Jackson comes in the form of the Whig Party. The leader of the Whig Party for many, many years, really through about 1850, is a guy by the name of Henry Clay. You see Clay there on the right on your screens. So again, Jackson was certainly popular amongst the people, and can really be considered the first populist president of the United States. He ran at first in 1824, and he ended up losing due to a technicality. He won the popular vote, lost. There was no winner in the Electoral College. It goes to the House of Representatives, and the House elects John Quincy Adams as the nation's 6th president. Jackson and his supporters proceed to make Adams' life as president a living heck, and so eventually Adams ends up losing the presidency to Jackson, who will serve 2 terms. Jackson is going to be the first guy to really identify as part of the Democratic Party, which was really sort of an extension of the Jeffersonian Party, just now with a new titular figure in, Andrew Jackson as opposed to Thomas Jefferson. Although really both the Jacksonians and the Whigs are going to claim Jefferson in some way, shape, or form. The opposition to Jackson is going to eventually sort of coalesce into a group that will become known as the Whig Party. The Whigs are named after a British political party of the same name at approximately the same time. Neither one still exists in that form today. So the opposition to Jackson is saying that Jackson is being way too much of a quote-unquote tyrant, that he is overstepping his authority. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anybody else. So they are going to glom together and form the Whig Party, which favored more power to Congress and to a lesser extent to the states than to the federal executive. The Whigs also wanted national infrastructure projects. And this is back in the 1820s, 1830s. They were talking about a national system of roads that won't truly develop until we get into the first one's really Route 66 is the most famous. But then really the federal interstate system, which doesn't happen until the 1950s. So it takes over 100 years before this really takes off. But it's interesting to think about. So the one of the things that the Whigs are going to do is they are going to try and unify lots of disparate groups into this one political party, but it can't last. And one of the big reasons for that is, of course, the question of slavery. They could not keep both sides really satisfied in that. If they argued too much for abolition, then their slaveholding constituents are going to start to walk away. If they argue too much for states' rights in regards to slavery, then their northern anti-slavery constituents are going to start to walk away. And that's ultimately what's going to split the Whig Party and basically have the Whig Party cease to exist, is the issue of slavery. And that's going to happen by the early part of the 1850s, where really they just can't hold this thing together. Now, were there Democrats that were also anti-slavery, Democrats that were pro-slavery? Yes. And actually what we're going to see is a realignment due to the issue of slavery. And that's, of course, going to involve the rise of the Republican Party and the American Civil War. On the left, of course, you see probably the most photographed individual from this time period, Abraham Lincoln. And on the right, his opponent in the 1864 presidential election, General McClellan, General George McClellan. There we go. There's the first name. So as the Whigs split, you have now this little disparate collection of smaller parties. You have, of course, these former Whigs kind of hanging out there. There are Northern Whigs, there are Southern Whigs. The Southern Whigs tend to be pro-slavery. They are going to kind of fold largely into the Democratic Party. The Northern Whigs are just kind of hanging out there going, okay, what do we do next? There was another party called the Free Soil Party, which was a very explicit abolitionist party. And then you have Northern Democrats who are also hanging out there going, well, the Democratic Party is becoming a little too pro-slavery for my taste. And they are going to combine, especially after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and opposing that, they are going to combine into a new political party known as the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is going to come out, they were an anti-slavery party, but they also weren't politically, they didn't want to harm themselves politically. So they're going to come out and say, yeah, we're against slavery, but we're not going to touch it where it currently exists. What we want to do is keep it from spreading to these new territories that are picked up after the Mexican-American War. You have what is today basically the American Southwest, plus California, plus, of course, the Oregon Territory that comes about around the same time, part of what is today Montana. And all of that is sort of this blank canvas in terms of, will it be slave territory? Will it be free territory? And so the Republicans are going to sort of moderate, even though they certainly had the elements saying, we need to abolish slavery and we need to do it yesterday. They're really, as a party, going to very much moderate. They will run their first candidate for president in 1856. He will lose to James Buchanan. But then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln will successfully win the presidency, thanks to the Democratic Party splitting in two, the Northerners nominating Stephen Douglas, the Southerners nominating John Breckinridge, plus another party. This was a four-party presidential race, and the fact that one candidate actually came out on top in this and it did not end up getting thrown to the House of Representatives is remarkable, because other times when that has happened in our history, the election ends up going to the House. So this is like Lincoln literally gets just the amount of votes, electoral college votes, he needs to become president. And most of the country voted for somebody else. So the Republicans, who had only been a party for 6 years or so, are now at the forefront of national power. And then, of course, the South is going to secede, and the Republicans are going to be able to very much consolidate that power, as much of the strength of the Democratic Party is going to secede with the South. So this is then going to obviously lead to the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, Reconstruction, when the more strident elements of the Republican Party are really going to take over that effort after getting sick of Andrew Johnson, and they are going to press for passage of civil rights laws, constitutional amendments to codify those things. And at the same time, white Southerners are going to be very, very resistant to this. And so you're going to at least see the names of our two modern parties start to appear at this point, and they won't really go away after that. Now, what those parties believe in changes over the years. So please don't say, oh, well, Lincoln was a Republican, so obviously Republicans believe in the same thing Lincoln did. Actually, if you look at it, today's Republicans believe in very different things than what Lincoln believed in. And same with modern Democrats versus Democrats back then. Very, very different. So please you can't just sub, Abraham Lincoln for Donald Trump today. They are ideologically not the same. Same with, you can't sub Nancy Pelosi and George McClellan, let's say. I was trying to think of another prominent Democrat from back then, but they all start to blend together in your head. So this is one of the first points where civil rights is going to be a huge division point in American politics, but it certainly will not be the last. The next realignment is going to take place in the late 1920s, early part of the 1930s, and that is going to involve the gentleman on the left. That is, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR, and then the gentleman on the right there is, he ran against Roosevelt at one point. He becomes the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and his name is Charles Evans Hughes. I guess he ran against, it wasn't FDR, he runs for president at some point. Losing my mind. But anyway, so what starts this out is actually the collapse of the American economy, beginning in 1928. Really, it actually had started even before that, especially if you were a farmer. But the general public sees this in 1928, 1929, or 1929, 1930, excuse me. And Roosevelt's response to that, known as the New Deal, is going to help realign the parties. And for really from 1932 to 1980, the Democratic Party is going to be the home of, like most American workers, especially if you were a member of a union, for example. Roosevelt will also bring in, or start to bring in, black voters to the Democrats for the first time. Remember, these had been voters who had been Republicans since Lincoln's time and had supported Republicans, even though oftentimes they couldn't vote during that time. But they will start supporting Roosevelt in the 1930s. That will carry over to supporting Harry Truman. That will carry over to supporting the Democrats in subsequent elections, really until we get to about, well, actually to this day. But the other thing the other group that Roosevelt's going to tie together with this is Southern whites. So even though Roosevelt starts to move down that path towards supporting civil rights for the Democrats, Southern whites are going to stay in the boat, largely because of that institutional memory of, well, the Republicans were the ones that sent troops in after the Civil War and did all this Reconstruction stuff we didn't like. That's going to last, again, about 64, really done by the early part of the 1970s. But between 1932 and about 1980, Democrats are going to control most of the presidential elections, most of the congressional elections. In fact, the Republicans don't gain back control of the House in any meaningful way until about 1994. Off and on, they have control of the Senate, but really, it's like a 60-some year period where the Democrats control the House of Representatives since this point. And again, the Depression and the New Deal are going to prompt a lot of black voters to shift from the Republican Party to the Democrats, even though many New Deal programs, because of being overseen by Southerners or run by Southerners, won't be open to African Americans. Things were still better there than what they maybe would have been for African Americans had Roosevelt's opponent in 1932 been successful, Herbert Hoover. So there we go. And then another shift that's going to happen is in the 1960s, when the Democratic Party is really going to very much start to alienate their southern wing in their progress towards, in their pursuit of civil rights for certainly African Americans, but that will end up being a pursuit for civil rights for Native Americans. That will end up being a pursuit for civil rights for Hispanic Americans. That will translate into rights for homosexuals and other marginalized groups. In this picture here, you see President Johnson in 1960, I think this was 64, signing the Civil Rights Act into law in the presence of folks like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and lots of senators and Congress people. One person I don't see is Montana's Senator Mansfield. He didn't like to attend these sorts of things, even though he was instrumental in actually getting that law passed. Sometime, Mike Mansfield, look him up. But this transformation actually had started even before that, with Harry Truman and his embrace of civil rights via desegregating the armed forces. And Truman's pursuit of civil rights is going to lead to the gentleman on the left, a guy by the name of Strom Thurmond, to end up bolting from the Democratic Party and forming his own party. This was known as the Dixiecrats. And he's going to run for president in 1948 on the Dixiecrat ticket, such as it was. And he will actually gain some electoral votes. This is one of the very few times in American history when a third party actually gains electoral votes. You don't see that very often. This is going to lead to, in 1964, the first real break of what was called the Solid South. The Democrats had had control of the South for a long, long time. Headed back to Reconstruction times. And in 1964, with the nomination of Barry Goldwater, who came out vehemently against the advances in civil rights, while he was running against Lyndon Johnson, who was very much in favor of those advances in civil rights, you will see the Republican Party for the first time break into the Solid South and win a number of states in the American South, and that will then be consolidated first by Richard Nixon in his Southern strategy, and later by Ronald Reagan. So again, the Democratic support of civil rights from Truman in 48 to the Civil Rights Act of 1864, the Voting Rights Act of 1865, will start to alienate white Southern Democrats, and you start to see candidates like George Wallace emerge, and Wallace will end up running for president as a third party candidate, and he will actually gain some success too. Not very many electoral votes, but he does, I think in 68, I think he gets a couple. But again, the Dixiecrats, so the Southern Democrats, are going to start to break off. Not officially at first, but by the time we get to 1968, though, lots of those white Southern Democrats are going to start to break towards the Republican Party for the first time, and that's going to just continue as we go into the 1990s, into the 2000s, into the 2010s. And beyond. This was, Richard Nixon had called it the Southern Strategy, which was basically peeling the Southern whites away from the Democrats and getting them to support Republicans, largely on the basis of Republicans' lack of support for civil rights, for things like busing African American students and white students to mixed high schools as opposing to maintaining school segregation. By the 1980s, the Republicans are going to control most white Southern votes, particularly male Southern votes, whereas African Americans are going to remain very firmly entrenched in the Democratic Party camp. You start to see maybe a little bit of fraying of that in our most recent presidential election, but no more than a percentage or two. And it's not seen as something that's probably going to accelerate, at least according to any source that I've read so far. This is going to help lead to that red-blue political map that we know of today. And here is the map from, I think this was 2020, by county. And you can see that there's lots of red on that map, but the blue areas are largely where a lot of the population resides, which is one of the reasons why we don't do things by county. We do them in states. We do that by overall popular vote. Then, of course, we have the Electoral College, which, yeah, let's not get started on that. Structural factors that favor the two-party system for the United States. Number one, we have what are known as single-member districts. So instead of, let's say, let's talk about California, for example. So let's say overall the electorate in California is, let's say, 60% Democrat, 40% Republican, and I don't know if those numbers are legit. I'm just using it as an example. Then in other systems where you don't have the single member district, you would have a situation where 60% of those seats from California would go to Democrats and 40% would go to Republicans. Whereas in the American system, your representative is elected by your particular little district. So in Montana, for example, here in Great Falls, we live in Montana Congressional District number 2. So we can only vote for the representative for this district. We don't get to have a say in District 1, which is the western part of the state. We don't, here in Great Falls, get to really have a say in that. So yeah, it's a single member district, and we have a plurality system where even if, let's say, the Democrats are running a candidate, the Republicans are running a candidate, the Green Party is running a candidate, and the Libertarian Party is running a candidate. So let's say there are 4 candidates in the race. I think Georgia might be the only state where, in order to get elected, you have to have a majority vote, 50% plus 1. In most states, it's what's called plurality. Whoever gets the most votes wins. Even if there are 10 candidates, even if the top vote getter only gets 15%, they then win the election. Whereas in other systems, you have to have an actual majority, 50% plus one vote. So what this does is it discourages more minor parties. It discourages small parties. It discourages parties that might just be getting on their feet because they're unlikely to gain any power. Whereas in say a parliamentary system or something like that, you could have a situation where the party wins enough seats to actually, or wins enough votes to gain some seats in the parliament, and then they could get a reputation and gain more seats. That's very, very hard to happen in the American system. Yeah. So in a first past the post system, so basically whoever gets the most votes wins. You're going to have two dominant parties. So what would become smaller parties are going to sort of merge together. And that can be a good thing. It certainly simplifies choices. But it also is really going to discourage any sort of minor party from gaining any kind of real power. Because most voters are going to fear trying to support a minor party because they're going to, well, either the Democrats or the Republicans are going to win anyway. So if I vote for this minor party person, I'm just throwing my vote away. What it could also be is, you are supporting, for, let's just say it's 2016, and instead of supporting Hillary Clinton, you don't like Hillary Clinton, okay, fine. And so you decide to vote for Jill Stein. Or it's 2000 and you don't like Al Gore, so you decide to vote for Ralph Nader. Whereas your vote maybe would have gone to that major party candidate, and then the candidate you really don't like ends up winning. So there can be positives to it, there can be negatives to it. And so plurality voting also ends up rewarding sort of catch-all parties, broad parties. Whereas proportional representation in countries that do that actually encourages multiple parties, because then those parties are going to naturally come together to try and form a governing coalition, and they can actually support the issues that they're passionate about probably more effectively by threatening to withhold their support for other things. So potentially weaker parties have more power in a proportional system than they do in like a first past the post system. Yeah. So obviously right now, one of the situations happening in our two-party system is that at the moment our federal government is shut down. And this means a number of things. Most federal workers are either being furloughed, so they're basically saying, go home, you can't work right now, or the sort of essential federal workers are being told, okay, you need to show up to work, but we're not paying you until after this is over. One of our last government shutdowns lasted 40 some days. Can you go more than a month without a paycheck? Most of us probably can't. Many of us live what's known as paycheck to paycheck and don't really have the financial capacity to be able to dip into reserves. Most of us don't have reserves because we are basically living paycheck to paycheck. And you can see on the screen lots of other things that could happen. TSA shortages could lead to longer waits at the airport if you're flying somewhere. Now, I will say air traffic controllers still on the job, but again, not being paid, just sort of on the promise that, okay, one day this is going to end and we're going to give you back pay at that time. So that's one of the things that's happening in our two-party system right now, because the two parties cannot come together and pass either a budget or a continuing resolution to continue funding the government for 90 days or whatever, to give them more time to reach an agreement. So a lot of people would say that our democracy here in America is certainly very vulnerable to one or both parties acting like petulant children. So advantages of the two-party system include stability, simplicity. When you only really have two real choices, it's easier to make a decision than, oh, well, should I support the Tories? Should I support the Conservatives? Or should I go with the Green Party? Or should I go with Labor? Or should I go with this, that, or the other? And so it makes your choices a lot easier, but it also leads to people going, I don't like either of my choices. I wish there was a third option. It does lead to sort of broad coalitions. Your party has to appeal to sort of broad constituency, but at the same time, then your party is appealing so broadly that, there's some people that are going, well, I'm going to support them, but I don't like them. They believe in this and I don't believe in that, but I believe in lots of the other stuff they believe in. It does tend to lead to peaceful transfers of power. The losers generally accept the outcome, figuring that, hey, next cycle, we could be back in power. Obviously, in 2020, that ends up being challenged a bit. But I'm not going to go too far into that. And it also leads to clear accountability. Voters can punish one party, reward another party, and they don't have to then deal with. So in other countries, parties have to put together these coalitions, and if the voters want to punish one party, or if one party leaves, then the whole coalition crumbles and they have to scramble to get a new coalition together. That doesn't happen in a two-party system because there's only the two parties. There's the one that is in the majority and the one that is in the minority. There's, for lack of a better term, winners and losers. Now, of course, disadvantages, you don't have the political diversity. You don't get minority viewpoints. They don't have a chance to really gain any wider acceptance, because when push comes to shove, the parties are going to vote the way that their leaders tell them to vote. And there's no chance for surprises thanks to, minor parties, because at this point there's, I think, 2 independents in the U.S. Senate, and that's it. And they both basically work with the Democrats. I don't remember if we have an independent in the House anymore. I know we used to, but that guy ended up getting elected to the Senate. There is definitely a polarization effect, and we're seeing that in today's politics, sort of an us versus them, fosters hostility, discourages compromise. We're really seeing that right now with the government shutdown. Gridlock, just plain and simple. And again, we're seeing this right now. The parties cannot agree on how to fund the government. One party wants to stop subsidizing healthcare via the Affordable Care Act. The other party is willing to die on the Hill to try and keep that. So there's very little compromise going on. And as a result of all of this, voters become very overwhelmed, and many of them sort of tune out. They turn off. They go, they can't agree. All politicians are useless, and I'm not going to pay attention to this, even though, sure, you may not care about politics, but the decisions of politicians greatly impact you. So, yeah. But, yeah, we see that time and time again. More and more Americans just don't vote every year. We barely crack 50% turnout in our elections anymore, whereas go to some of these other countries and you see 50, 60, 70, 80% turnout for their elections. In America, we largely take it for granted, or many of our electorate are just tuned out because the news cycle is overwhelming, or they feel like, well, none of them get anything done anyway. And just the two major party symbols. So to kind of wrap this up, Our two-party system has evolved through historical conflicts from, Jefferson and Hamilton through to Jackson and the Whigs, through Lincoln and the Republicans versus the Democrats, to the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement and all of these things. Our political system continues to evolve and is continuing to evolve. We're starting to see maybe some of that in today's system. We're seeing workers more and more sort of siphoning away from, especially white workers, siphoning away from the Democratic Party in favor of the Republican Party. You see realignments during these eras that reshape who is in the party, who chooses the other party. And we've seen that time and time again. We see the winner-take-all elections, the plurality voting that has entrenched the two major parties, and we see that while the system offers stability and moderation, it also fosters polarization and limits diversity. And we're seeing this right now. We're seeing definite polarization in Washington. We're seeing that the last few Congresses have not been able to accomplish a whole heck of a lot because the majority party has the minority party that is willing to basically die on the hill to keep them from doing what they're doing. And that extends really to both parties. Some would argue one more than the other, but regardless, both parties have those issues that they will, go to the mattresses over, essentially. And this is leading to, some would argue, very ineffective governance, and even the current administration starting to use more executive-only authority versus trying to get things through Congress where they're just not able to do it. Okay, so in your reflection journal this week, I want you to reflect on the advantages and the disadvantages of the two-party system. So give me a couple of the advantages, give me a couple of the disadvantages. Try and put those in your own words to the best of your ability. And based upon what you've learned about the history and structural features, discuss how the two-party system offers stability and encourages broad coalitions. Then consider its drawbacks, such as polarization, legislative gridlock, the exclusion of minority viewpoints, etc. In your view, would reforms like ranked choice voting or proportional representation, ranked choice voting, by the way, is where instead of just choosing one candidate, you rank them. So, maybe you choose the Libertarian first and the Republican second and the Democrat third and the Green Party fourth, just as an example, in your congressional race or what have you. So would reforms like that, like ranked choice voting, proportional representation, improve participation in our democracy and in representing us? And so trying to answer those questions and explain your reasoning and any potential trade-offs. So I'm looking for a nice 6-sentence paragraph, let's say. All right, it's more than just yes. I want to know your thinking on this. So definitely go ahead and fire up that journal and get that done. Remember, that's worth 15 points to your grade. Thank you all for paying attention today. I really appreciate it. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.